Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the process that happens with the response team itself, so that those of you who are learning kind of know what we do. The first thing that happens is, well, let me just say something before I start that. Let me say something. I've been a little bit pushy about name tags, and the reason I've been pushy about name tags is because when we go into a church, I think it's really important that we are identified, so that if we're in a hallway and someone's walking in the hall and they need someone to talk to, they can see our tag and they'll know that we're part of the team and that we can help them out. I think that's really important. So that's the only reason I was pushing everybody to wear name tags today, was to make that point that when we go into a church, I think it's really important for the team to have their name tags. Also, something that most of our team knows this, but not everybody in the conference knows this, but when we talk to other conferences or other groups about the response team from the Susquehanna Conference, they go, "Oh, you're the ones." People know us all over the country. Betty Westlake Reese talked about talking to someone in Seattle, in a church in Seattle, or a conference in Seattle, and they knew us. They knew of the Susquehanna Conference response team. So we have some expertise on this team. We've been around a while. We've done some excellent work. We're not afraid to grow and learn and change. We're not afraid to be educated in new ways, and we're not afraid to share what we have learned and what we know and what works for us in specific situations. So I just wanted you to be aware of that we are well known, and that we are still learning and we are still sharing. So here's what happens. Here's the process that happens when a complaint's filed. First of all, a complaint has to be filed, and it has to be signed, and it has to go to the bishop. And when a complaint is filed, if the bishop deems that it is appropriate and necessary that the response team be involved, then the district superintendent in the district where the complaint has happened contacts the response team convener, which right now is me. And the DS then calls me and gives me as much information as possible. And it's really important to know things like any history related to the accused. Is this, what kind of history has this person had in their background? And I'm going to use the word victim because that's where I am in this. I think it's a victim and an accused. So that's the terminology I'm going to use. We use different terminologies, I guess. Each one of us uses different terminologies at different times. So I'm going to use victim and accused. So it's really important to know any history related to the accused, any history that we can get related to the victim, so that we can find a matching support person, someone who can best help in that situation. It's also helpful to know any history of trauma that's happened in the church, so that we don't go in blind. We don't go in not knowing what has happened in that congregation. So I try to get as much information as possible from the district superintendent. The next thing I do is send out an email to the team and say, there's a new case, heads up, just so the team knows that. The next thing I do is contact the victim, if I can contact the victim, and sometimes that's not doable, sometimes it is. One of the first parts of the conversation that I have with the victim is an apology. That's one of the first parts of the conversation. Mostly it's listening, but I apologize on behalf of the conference. When it's appropriate in the conversation, I offer a support person to walk through the victim with the process. Sometimes in that conversation, it seems appropriate to offer the opportunity for counseling. Sometimes it's not, because victims can sometimes feel like, well, they're offering me counseling because they think I'm crazy. And so because we have that stigma attached to counseling in our society, I try to gauge that a little bit, and if I don't get a chance to offer that, I make sure that the support person or advocate has an opportunity, or knows that has not been offered, and see if they can find a space to do that. If this person doesn't ask for a support person or an advocate, then I would offer the counseling in any case. So then the next thing I do is contact the accused. And I explain the role of the response team and offer a support person to guide the accused through the process. As we've already stated. Often that is refused. Sometimes what I hear is, I'll get back to you on that. And I usually call again and offer some support and try to help through the process. But I don't know that I've ever had, well, I guess I had one accused that took a response person, and that was an unfortunate situation. That was the only case I've ever heard of in our conference where the accused was innocent. Or we couldn't find any evidence, let's put it that way. So then, after that, sometimes if you talk to the accused and you say, does your family need any help? They'll say, no, 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 no. So I don't usually ask that of the accused, and I just think that's not helpful. I usually try to contact the spouse separately in some other way if I can. Now, children I can't contact because that's not appropriate, but I usually ask the spouse if there are children involved, if they would need some help, and offer that opportunity. Often a spouse will ask for some help. And just a note that we do offer to pay for counseling for anyone who wants that kind of help throughout the whole process. We offer it for the victim, for the accused, for families, friends, folks within the congregation, and actually we offer to pay for counseling if folks from a former congregation are in need after the suspension is made public. So I make sure that we all know that. We all know that. So then the next thing I do is contact the team members and ask for someone to come with me, or someone, if I can't be there. I always like to be there when the suspension letter is read. If I can't be there, then I ask for some other folks to be there. But if I can be there, I go and I ask for at least one other person to be there with me when the letter's read. It does two things. It takes some of the pressure off the district superintendent, because the district superintendent can say, talk to them. And because the district superintendent is going to get all of the anger, if there's anger at first, when they read the letter. And the letters they always think the letter's inappropriate. They shouldn't be reading it in church because there are children there. There might be guests there. There are all kinds of reasons that the letter is inappropriate to be read by the congregation, but this is the way we need to do it. This is the way that works to do this. So this is the way we do it. So for response team members to be there and kind of help keep things a little bit settled is helpful. Mostly when the letter's read, the first reaction is shock, disbelief, and denial. Anger is usually not quite as red hot at that point as it is later, but there's often some anger in that situation too. So if you're called to ask to go into a church when the district superintendent reads the letter of suspension, those are some of the emotions that you're going to see in the congregation. You're going to see shock, you're going to see disbelief, denial, and perhaps even a little bit of anger. One of the things that I have found that is really helpful when you go into a situation where a pastor is removed under those circumstances, when the letter is read, is to be very clear with the folks that talk to you that they may contact the pastor, they may write letters, they may send notes, they can send flowers, but they cannot put the pastor in a position where the pastor needs to respond to them. So they need to be, because the pastor's not allowed to do that. The pastor's been put in a position where the pastor's no longer allowed, a part of that is allowed to respond to that congregation. That pastor is removed from the congregation. So it's helpful if they hear that they're not cut off completely. They can send flowers, they can let them, they can have some closure. And that's one of the things, one of the ways that they can have closure. The next thing I do and ask when I'm contacting the team, I ask for support persons to be available if needed. So I'll say, will you, if needed, will you support the children? Will you be a support person or advocate for the spouse, and so on and so on. So I ask people to kind of be on the lookout for a note from me asking them to be a response person or a support person. And if they are, if they need you, then I'll send you all the information you'll need to contact them. So then the next thing I do, and when I ask you to be a support person, I will give you as much information as I have. You will know what I know, so that you'll be able to have some background in the way you're dealing with a situation. So then the next thing I do is contact the staff parish chair of the church and try to set up a congregational meeting. It's helpful to arrange this as quickly as possible, so that's why there's a heads up to the team that we're going to try to do that as quickly as possible. We meet with the staff parish and church leaders prior to the congregational meeting. Sometimes it's difficult to set up that meeting. Staff parish is reluctant, and we don't want that. You don't want, but then we don't need for you guys to come in here. And sometimes I just have to say, the bishop says we have to come, so you have to take us. But because they're reluctant to have us come in, but they're not always reluctant, but sometimes they are. So we meet with the staff parish in a separate meeting. First, what happens when we do the team meeting, we meet as a group and we talk a little bit about what the situation is. Then we meet with the staff parish and the church leaders. And part of the purpose of that is to allow them to express their frustration initially and kind of so that they're calmed down and feeling a little bit more positive about our presence by the time we go into the congregational meeting. Sometimes we don't have enough people to do small groups, to have 2 response team people in the small groups, so we have 1 church leader and 1 response team person when we get into a situation like that, if we've gotten the church leaders sort of on board with us. So that's one of the purposes of that. It's important to offer this opportunity to the church leaders so that they can express their thoughts and the thoughts of the congregation, so we kind of know what we're getting into. It's also important for the leaders to understand what their role is and what our role is before we go in with the congregation, what we're doing, because we're not coming in there telling them what to do, and we need for the church leaders to be aware of that as we go in. Excuse me. It also, after I contact the staff parish, I send a letter to the, send a letter to them asking them to send this out to their congregation, which basically invites the congregation to the congregational meeting with a little card that they respond, yes, I'm coming, and so forth. Often there's a resistance on that too, because we don't have enough money, all kinds of things like that. We don't want to do this, it's too much trouble, we don't want everybody to know our business, and all those kinds of things. So we sometimes have to finesse into getting that letter and getting the congregational meeting done. So then I send out a notice after we've set a date with the staff parish and gotten the letter all organized, then I send out a note to the team and find out who's available. And I would just say, please, if you get a letter, an email from me, try to make that date a priority when the notice is sent so we can have enough members to do the work. I know we all have lives, but if you can possibly make it a priority to be there, it's really important to have as many response team members as possible at an intervention. Sometimes we have more response team members than we have people in the congregation, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Because it shows that, if 4 of us show up to a congregation where there are 100 people, they're not going to think we care very much. But if 25 of us show up and there are 4 people in the congregation, they're going to say, boy, this team really cares about us. So that's helpful to have as many people as possible to show how much we can care about them. So then I asked one of the team members to be a team leader for the intervention, and I should have had the information on the role of team leader in the book, but I don't. So I will send that out so that you'll have that information about what a team leader needs to do for an intervention. So then we have the congregational meeting, and when you go to the congregational meeting, here's what you need to expect. You need to expect lots of anger. You might not get it, but you need to expect it. You need to expect denial. You need to expect the blame to be placed on the victim or on the conference for all of this. Why would you come in here and take our pastor away from us? He's a nice guy. Why don't we just forgive him? Or the blame is placed on the victim. The case that just really makes me crazy was a case where a pastor, I'm not sure about exactly how all this is my first case, so and I'm trying to remember all the details, but a pastor ran off with an 18-year-old girl from his congregation. And I was talking about it with someone in the community, and this person said to me, well, that little girl's always been a slut. She already ruined one family. She had an affair with her teacher. So she was victimized twice. And when I have to tell you, when I was having this conversation with someone in the community, my children were with me, and they stepped back. because they knew I was gonna say something. I was very nice, but that's the kind of thing that you hear, she just wanted it, she just was all over him, and that kind of stuff. The other thing we're going to hear is about forgiveness. We need to be forgiving. Why can't we be forgiving? And why can't he come back is another issue that we need to deal with. So those are some things that happen in the congregational meeting that we need to deal with. I'm just going to give you a brief outline here of the thing that happens in the congregational meeting. After we meet with the staff parish, we have a congregational meeting, we have worship, we have the letter of the apology that is read by a district superintendent, not the district superintendent of the district where this happened. In this case, when we do the intervention, we have another district superintendent there. We give what information is appropriate, and then we break into small groups, then we gather again after we've broken into small groups where folks have a chance to talk a little bit, and then we offer support people for counseling and any other help, and then we send folks forth. And I'm going to ask, we have some folks here who are going to talk a little bit about some letters and some of the other things that I mentioned here. But I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the things about the restoration, and I think we've hit on that the restoration is offered, and that's offered by the bishop and the cabinet. That's not something that the response team has any control over, but we can say that if this person it recognizes that this was sexual misconduct, and if this person is approved by the bishop and the cabinet, then restoration can happen, and that's a long process. So we do offer that and let them know that.
Thank you. So in your binder, there's a tab that says Response Team Process, and at the beginning of that, there are a couple of sample-ish letters that are appropriate for congregations. So here's what happened. Elaine said that on the Sunday following a pastor's removal, the district superintendent of that church will be present along with Elaine if she can be there, and one or two other folks from the response team, so that the district superintendent can preach, can read the letter, but can also say, if there's anybody who would like to talk about this, who has been impacted in a way that you would like to touch base with somebody, here are these folks. And that's been a new practice and has been a super helpful practice of having folks present when the letter is read. And one of the things that I clearly heard Bill Waddell, who is counsel for the bishops, talk about at a national training, at a Do No Harm training, was how important it is that the disclosure letter give as much information as possible so as to curb rumors and to make sure that we're speaking truth. And part of what I think is interesting in the two samples that are in the book, the second one doesn't give a whole lot of information, doesn't go into a whole lot of depth of information about the complaint. And I think that maybe I wrote this one. And I think that it was because there were pieces of information in the complaint early on that hadn't felt like there was real clarity to them, and that this was the suspension letter related to the only person of which we are aware who was found innocent at this point. And so this was a letter that was really trying to emphasize the process and the appropriateness of suspension when it comes to protecting the person who made the complaint, the pastor against whom the complaint is made, as well as the church. And so that's some of this letter. The first letter has some possibility to add to it some details around the complaint itself. For example, a few paragraphs down, where right underneath where it says "See end of letter for more suggestions," the complaint is related to inappropriate behavior and boundary crossing with an adult woman who is not his wife and not a minor child. So right there kind of spells out some of what the complaint actually is, as opposed to leaving it totally open to speculation for the congregation. What I want to share with you is, when it comes to writing this particular letter, the practice of the cabinet is to write the letter and share the letter around and around and around with the rest of the cabinet to make sure that the letter has covered everything it needs to cover. And I believe that we share letters with Elaine before we read them to make sure that there isn't anything that we have missed that we need to name, particularly because I felt like when I was at that last Do No Harm training and Bill Waddell was going to speak about suspension letters, that I was waiting with bated breath to hear, what can I really, actually, truly, from a legal standpoint, say that will be helpful? Because that feels like a very kind of tenuous need. And so we make sure that many appropriate eyes have had a chance to look at these letters before they actually are read. But one of the pieces that I think is so important as well regarding these letters is that once they've been perfected, once they're put to paper, the district superintendent read them verbatim, word for word. No making things up, no summarizing, no adding extra pauses. The letter is read as it is written and then can be distributed. It's left in the hands of the church leadership. It can be posted on the wall if they want. It can be mailed to every member. It's that way there is no room for someone to say, well, the DS said, and it kind of lead to a different story. And so letters are read verbatim, and the goal is to inform, to speak truth, but to also address any, or to curb as much as possible, any of the rumor mongering that exists in this process. Now, one of the, and unfortunately, the reality is in some of our churches that in some situations when the pastor gets up to read the letter, there are no children present for parents to be offended that they might have heard. But it is appropriate for the DS to say something along the lines of, you may want to, parents, or grandparents even, take your children out of worship at this point because we're going to read a letter that discusses a sensitive issue. So that creates that opportunity. But again, that letter then can become very, very public within the congregation. Sometimes there's a need for two letters. The first letter happens when a pastor is suspended, and then a second letter happens once the process has done what the process does from the bishop's vantage point. And then the second letter either reads that the complaint has been dismissed because there was not merit found, or that the pastor has surrendered credentials under complaint, and here's what happens next for the church. And that communication then happens for the congregation. Right. And that this is where we go next, this is what happens next. So once the bishop's process comes to a conclusion, there's a need to communicate with the congregation around what has happened and what comes next. And again, that is all couched within what can be shared and enough to help with rumor control. Questions about the letters? So does somebody talk about that in a little bit? Yeah. Okay. So Donna, are you comfortable with holding that question until they talk about that within the context of the process per the discipline? Okay. So what I would say is if you don't hear the answer, to ask again. Okay. Anything else regarding the letters? Okay, then we're good.
Because you did introduce like the process of us when we go in. So one thing, and this will be a follow-up, it relates to your the role of the leader. There is actually a little guide for the leader that I wrote up that we'll follow back up with. You'll get it by email or something, that this is what, it's kind of a nice little process. So when we go in and meet with the SPRC, then we do the service of hope. You have a couple versions of that under the same section. If you're in that section, there was one we used for a while, and then I believe it was you, Elaine, who came up with a beautiful new one that gave some others. So there's like two versions, and I think there's actually some more versions out there. So somebody would be, people take parts of this, or one person does it. We've broken it up a couple different ways, but members of the team will be assigned that before they go to lead the service of hope. And the way we've been doing it is the DS has been doing that letter again, and then we could move right into the service of hope. And then the next part I just want to talk a little bit more is the small group. And you're actually going to be practicing some of that later at the end of the day. What fun. But the small group is a way to give people an opportunity to walk through what has happened in terms of the impact on them. And it's based on a CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management, debriefing process that is used with first responders, but they're doing more just general public too. So it was adapted for the faith community from this book, When a Congregation is Betrayed, Responding to Clergy Misconduct. And so you have that in there. You can see that also in the thing. But we have another version that we'll send you afterwards that is a little simpler than that has some language that's a little easier to read. And so what we do in that is we have someone who is like the leader of that group, and then there's the support person in the group. And if we have more team members, there might be a couple support people in that group, depending on how many. Depending on how many people come to this congregational meeting, if we only have 4 people, we're not breaking into small groups. But if we have, now the last large response I think we had like 4 groups going. And we had a leader, a facilitator, and a support person in every single group. So we had 8 members of our team that were doing small groups. And so you don't know. You have no clue when you go what you're going to get at all. But so the small group discussion guide that was created based on this is really a way of putting it out and going in rounds really with the people there. You will have people who like to talk, and you have people that don't like to talk. And so to give those people that don't like to talk the opportunity to express themselves and not be it all be controlled by the talkers, we prefer to do this in a round, and they can pass. They don't have to say anything if they don't want to. And some people have used the talking stick to make sure that only one person is talking at a time. But it works better, I have found, if you do it in rounds, and what you're really doing is, and he explains there, you establish rules, and that, this is, we want you to share openly, and it is for it's for your opportunity to express how this has impacted you. And then you find out who they are. So they go around and they state like their name and who and what is their role in the church. whether they've been there for 50 years and they've been a lay leader, or whether they just started coming last week, and this is all very new and shocking to have happen. Then their thoughts at, what were their first thoughts when they heard about this? Were the first they think. We won't go to the emotion right away. You go with the thoughts. And then, how did you react over time? Because usually we're not there for, well, sometimes it's been a while. Sometimes it takes weeks to get there. Sometimes it's within a week or two. So that's very unpredictable how long it's been since they've been told that, they've had this letter read at their service. And then what you're doing is you are validating that all those things are normal reactions. There isn't anything that's abnormal with the reaction. And that, there might be more things that happen you might think about, and they might be disturbing. And you're validating, allowing them to ventilate, validating their reactions, and then predicting and preparing them for what they might experience in the future. It is based on a critical incident, so it's safety, security you establish, you allow them to ventilate and validate that, and then you are predicting and preparing for the future. That's really what a crisis response is. And then we come back to share in the larger group, if they want to, and share what happened in their groups, and they can learn from each other. I mean, the reality is I find in the small group process is somebody's thinking that, but they think they're the only one that's thinking that. So if they say it, then the others say, oh yeah, I was wondering about that too, or I was thinking that, I was feeling that. It just gives them the opportunity, which they might not have had, to express themselves and to get validated for what they're feeling. We do try to sometimes talk about, we will be here if you want to bring us back in the future, and talk about that, there's steps in the healing process for the congregation, and, we would help them. And sometimes they will express things they particularly want from the conference. That has happened. And DSs lots of times get that, like, to-do list. I want this and I want that. Some things can be accomplished, some can't, but that's usually they're trying to take something back. But we always offer that we'll come back again to do that. So that's pretty much now, at the end of that, we do what is like a debriefing, and you do have a list of questions. I believe this is for the team. We do not want our team to leave and, be bothered by what's happened too. So we're going to talk about self-care later, but so we really get back together as a team then after everyone else leaves and check in and ground everybody before they leave and go home. And say, and in that is some of those points of, well, they specifically asked for this in our group. They want us to come back in 3 months, or they want to know this or that. And so those things are then recorded and given to Elaine, who then takes that on to wherever it should be. So that's kind of concrete, but it also gives us the chance to kind of get out of that listening and, observing everything and grounded before we get back on the road. So that's important, and that's done at the end it's very important. In terms of self-care, I feel it's really important. So it could take us a whole day to be there. You never know. Youth is here. Sometimes it's youth are the ones that are affected, and if that would be the case, I feel like we would set up something separate for youth, not mixing the adults and the youth. Most of the time, it says something in the letter that goes out, whether or not children are invited to come along to and what age is appropriate. But then if kids would come, I feel like we would maybe break them off into a group by themselves because some of the cases that we dealt with the children have been the victims, and they certainly need the opportunity. And so I think in even setting it up, it will be set up in a different way to address that. Yes. Jump in, Elaine.
The only time I can actually remember this happening is that we set up prior to the congregational meeting, we had a person who would be with the small group of young people who was skilled in that area. So it wasn't just like break into a small group and some of us who aren't really good with youth be stuck in there and not help, but somebody who had some experience in that area. So we've set that up ahead of time when we know, so it's good to know ahead of time.
It is. That's part of that, having those conversations and finding out what the needs are individually for every church can be very different. So it was suggested by one of our team members that we don't just talk at you all day. That we do something a little more interactive or something a little more interesting. So the current members of the team, we're going to do a little. That's what I was wondering of how to do it with being behind. All right.
Okay, so I'm one of those really weird people who likes role plays. Like everybody hates role plays except for me, apparently. But we're not going to have time for a role play just yet. But I was just going to read this scenario for you. It's a little unorthodox scenario for the things that we encounter or have encountered regarding clergy misconduct. So just be thinking about this as you're eating lunch. Talk about it. What would be the next steps for this team or for the congregations or however you see it. So John Paul is a member of the Alpha and Omega UMC. I don't know, it's not real. He's been attending for 7 years and recently took the leadership role on the SPRC. He depends on his church community as a source of support. He doesn't have a family in the area and his minimum wage job is barely enough to keep him his studio apartment. Pastor Maria has been hinting to him that she would like to start a relationship over the past 2 years. She nominated him to the SPRC in order to spend more time with him. He had begun to feel uncomfortable about her pursuit of him romantically, but didn't feel like he had any recourse. So Pastor Maria made him feel like God wanted him to have a sexual relationship with her, and if he didn't, then he was rebuking the will of God. Wanting to keep the peace within the church and people he considered family, he gave in to her. Peter, a mentor of John Paul, notices that things are different with him. When Peter approaches him, John Paul breaks down into tears and tells him everything. He encourages them to go together to the DS. What are the next steps? So, I don't know how quickly we have a couple of minutes if you guys want to just sort of popcorn answer, think about what we've already been talking about as next steps. We'll take a couple of minutes and then we'll jump into lunch.
So they have resolved to go to the DS.
Yes.
So the good response is the DS takes that call and sets up that meeting.
I'm out of town. Right now.
I'm in Mexico.
I'm in Mexico. Call Kathy Klein.
I think you run high in Mexico.
But that does happen, right? Somebody's away.
Yeah.
And
There
then
will be
that
somebody on call who will.
picks that up.
Yes, absolutely.
And this cabinet takes that seriously.
Oh, yes.
That's good.
They do.
Yeah, this cabinet takes misconduct very seriously.
And you're going to talk about that when you talk about the process, you're going to talk about because I think that's so important. I mean, when Sue was reading some things about I was afraid to go to the DS, and we heard that in the boundaries training, I would be afraid to go to the DS, and those kinds of things. We really need to be very clear how this cabinet works with that situation. So, yes.
And Pastor Maria missed the part in boundaries training where you never, ever, ever, ever date a member of your congregation.
Right, even if you're both single,
Rule number one.
you
even if
still
you're
never
both
do
single.
it.
And so would John Paul and Peter be immediately assigned support people? Because they're both now victims
Right.
here.
Actually,
No.
I don't know that we actually assign a support
Offer,
persons. We
offer,
offer,
right.
and that is because I would like to assign. No, you need one, take it. But that doesn't always happen.
Right, but it's offered.
Yes, yes. That- absolutely.
Does the DS then go to the pastor? I mean, how is the pastor informed that this is?
After an initial conversation, we would ask them for a written complaint. I'd be on the phone to the bishop. The bishop will determine, call the person in, we tell them about the complaint, you're suspended,
Start the process.
and the process starts.
Right, sometimes what the DSs do is say, so here in our process, this is what a complaint looks like, and here's how to file an official complaint. So that
Is
they
the-
have that information.
Is the pastor given details about what the accusation is?
The pastor will be read the written complaint.
Oh,
The written,
okay.
okay. All right.
So in that situation where the staff parish chair is the victim, would you then have to have an ad hoc chair elected out of that staff parish? You can't expect John Paul to
Right.
administer the church process with Elaine. I mean, that's not gonna.
Right, the
No.
DS would look for somebody else on the SPRC
Oh,
to be
to step up,
the
okay.
contact person and the person that they would work with.
Okay.
We've had that situation. We're close to that.
Oh, we do? Okay.
I would think that one thing that a good friend could do for the complainant in this process is to say, before we go see the DS, let's sit down and talk about what you are going to say to the DS. In order to, number one, make sure you don't miss anything, and number two, make sure that you're not going to downplay how this has affected you. So let's talk about how you're going to talk to the DS and what you're going to say, and I'll be there to help you with that.
And
Right.
perhaps even write that out.
Exactly.
Yep.
And perhaps the person has been keeping a journal or has
Right.
noted times.
So dates, that would be
Or
helpful.
sometimes has physical evidence in the very first situation, the woman who was, who the pastor seduced, basically, had physical evidence of notes and other things
Right.
that pastor had sent her.
Right,
Text messages.
yep.
Nowadays, it would be
Oh,
that,
the
but this is
text
back
message.
before that. This is back in the dark age.
Well, I understand that,
But she kept copies of that stuff and presented
But I
it.
remember the text message incident.
I remember text messages.
It was a neighbor, yeah, that's right, it was a neighbor, that's right. Left their phone out and the neighbor picked it up and texted.
It was on the porch, right?
You actually cannot make up the stuff.
Yeah, you can't. That one was the craziest. That was the craziest.
The pastor did blame the neighbor for
Yes.
sending a sex message.
Yes.
Oh, that's okay.
He must have left his phone on the porch and came along, picked up that phone and texted sex message to us. But yes, I'm serious. That was
I just wondered, when you talked about, children in the room and letting people know you might want to take them out, when you're sending the information about the meeting, can you at that point say, we will be discussing sensitive information, so if you must bring your children, plan accordingly?
Yeah.
I just did, in
My
a
child
new
care as well.
appointment, I preached on the image of God and included conversation about pornography and prostitution, and I told the congregation the week before, a part of my sermon next week is going to be R-rated, so that parents of young children, and I specifically said it's really the youngest children, probably most of the older children should be in the room, but I wanted to give them a heads up.
And sometimes it's even not talking about the misconduct itself, but the anger that can surface in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that can be more traumatizing for a child than
Oh,
anything.
yeah. Yeah.
And we usually leave copies of the letter, so that people who weren't there And again, that's rumor control.
That's
Here's the letter they read.
That's right.
Not, this is what I heard when
Right.
Yeah,
they read the letter.
I take a few copies with me.
Yeah.
Yep.
And say, please feel free to copy this, send
Isn't
it
that
out.
also sent out to members?
Yes.
constituents?
If they have some kind of system
Okay.
by which to do that.
But they make that choice.
They make that choice.
Right.
The congregation makes that choice. As far as youth are concerned, in a situation where, a lot of churches now don't have any youth, so we don't have to deal with it, which is unfortunate. But I think the congregational letter should invite the youth. Because they don't have to know all the details. Maybe they know more details than we even think they know, but because of the anger and the angst that's happening in the congregation, they're going to need someone to talk to, because particularly if they're involved in a youth group and the youth group in the church is pretty active, it can be traumatizing. I'm sorry?
And the youth group loves the pastor.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it can be traumatizing for the youth. So I think it's really important to have that invitation available to them and that offer available. And again, we always offer counseling for anybody, so the youth would be a part of that.
And sometimes that's the ongoing work of the response team that's willing to return. I had a situation when I was the pastor where I was the new pastor. The pastor prior to me had already said that the response team wasn't necessary. But when I got there, it seemed to me that the response team was most necessary with the youth ministry, with the youth group kids, and had made a request to my district superintendent that happen, because they were part of the group of victims and hadn't been cared for.
So one of the things that I would ask for you and Marion to address when you're talking about process is, who makes the decision about whether the response team comes in? Is the pastor the one who would say, gee, no, I don't think so? Is that going to happen? So I think that would be helpful to say what has happened now and how that process is changed now.
Have said, I don't care what the pastor says.
Yeah.
Well, and in many cases, the pastor's been suspended.
Well, yes, as often the pastor's been suspended. One of the things that I tell churches when we go in is, we are yours for life. Until the day we die, if you need us, we're coming. We have been sent to you, and we belong to you now. And once the bishop says go, we belong to that congregation, and we are there for them through the process, because this could last for years and years and years in these congregations. So I don't know. I just say we don't need the bishop's permission or the bishop to send us in a second time. Once we've gone in once, we belong. And I sort of think the bishop was okay with that. This bishop, anyway. Yes, Candy.
I have known churches, served in one, where something had happened back in the 30s and had never been dealt with. And so what you just said is so true, because the other side of it is that there had been a misconduct that was never dealt with. And as a lay speaker, people came to me and were still talking about this affair that happened in the 30s that was never dealt with.
Yeah.
And that was
The
like,
30s.
and there were still.
Yeah. Yeah, and we recently went into a church to deal with one issue, and it turned out while we were there that there was a whole history that this church was able to express and deal with and kind of lay out there to talk about a little bit, and they'd never had an opportunity to do that. So hanging in there with them as long as we can, as long as we're alive and well, is important to do.
And sadly, we have churches that have had multiple offenders.
Yes, yes.
Which is
Yes, we
kind of
have.
strange, where 3,
Yes.
4 pastors have offended and.
Yes, and congregations begin to think, what have we done? And that's unfortunate for congregations to feel that way, because then they get re-victimized, and that's hard too. And I don't know why that happens in certain congregations, and what, it's sort of like certain families have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The church
Yeah.
can support that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.